Welcome back to the seventh installation of us keeping track of ambiguous or outright confounding backfields in terms of the trends in rush, snap, and target shares. We begin once again with the Steelers backfield. This was the second straight game where Najee Harris was quite efficient. He wasn't quite as efficient in this one as he was in the previous matchup, but he was also facing the Jets, which makes this performance much more impressive than his performance against the Raiders, in my opinion. He had 21 attempts for 102 rushing yards. That's 4.9 per carry. Solid. A touchdown in a long of 34. And then we have Jaylen Warren. He did have 12 carries in this one, but he only had 44 rushing yards, so his 3.7 yards per carry wasn't nearly as efficient, and his long gain was 10 with no touchdown. Russ did steal a goal line touchdown, but overall, there was a lot more volume, obviously, because without Justin Fields at the helm, Russell Wilson just isn't going to eat into the rush share like he will. Although, obviously, there is the potential along the goal line for him to steal a touchdown. Through the air, though, Jaylen Warren was fine. He had 3 targets, including 2 receptions for 15 receiving yards. And then Najee Harris had 1 target, no catches, and no yards. And so Najee didn't really do anything in the passing game, and Jaylen Warren was fine, but nothing special. When we take a look at their average snap shares, Najee Harris averages 58%, and this one he had 49. And so that is interesting that Jaylen Warren was able to overtake him. Jaylen Warren, throughout the season, he has missed some time, and so that is impacting his average snap share. But on average, he's played 25% of the snaps. But in this one, he had 51% of the snaps played. And a majority of them, about 45% of his snap share, came before the fourth quarter. So it wasn't that he was just getting all this work when it was out of hand and didn't really matter. He was involved when it really mattered. And so that is interesting. When we take a look at the average rush share for Najee, throughout the season, he's averaged 48.54%. And this one, he had 58.33%. So an uptick there. On the season, once again, this is impacted by the injury and missing some time. But he's only had 3.95% of the rush share. And this one he had 33.33%. Pretty solid. When we take a look at the target share throughout the first 6 weeks, Najee Harris has averaged 11.90%, and this one he only had 3.7. And then on the season, Jaylen Warren has had 6.06%, and in this one had 11.11%. And so what can we conclude here? Well, now that Jaylen Warren is finally healthy, he did overtake Najee in terms of total snaps played. However, Najee easily led the backfield in terms of rush share. Through the air, Jaylen Warren did overtake him in this one. I do think that Jaylen Warren is a better receiving back in general than Najee. Not that Najee is a poor or anything, but I do think he is a better option. But in this scheme, Najee is a much better runner and in terms of being a much better fit. And so I do think that far and away, Najee Harris is the running back that you want to plug and play in your lineups. Although it is a little bit concerning potentially for down the stretch if Jaylen Warren continues to outsnap him in the event that he would also close the rushing gap. And so we will need to keep tabs on that. But for now, Najee Harris is a fine RB2, and Jaylen Warren really seems like a desperation flex at this point. But if he is able to increase his involvement, he definitely has some value. Moving on to the Vikings backfield. This was potentially the game of the week, the Vikings versus the Lions. And so it really was a tough matchup on paper. Although I will say that with the loss of Aiden Hutchinson, it does appear as though that's greatly going to impact the Lions in terms of their run defense. And so I do think it is pretty reasonable to expect that their run defense regresses without Hutchinson. But moving back to the Vikings backfield, Aaron Jones easily and by far and away was the RB1 in this one. He had 14 attempts for 93 rushing yards, 6.6 per carry, and a touchdown with a long of 34. Ty Chandler was minimally involved. He had 2 attempts for 4 yards, averaging 2 with no touchdown and a long of 3. And so through the air, Ty Chandler remains uninvolved, but Aaron Jones has a substantial role. And so he had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 23 receiving yards, averaging 7.7 per catch with no touchdown. When we take a look at the average snap shares throughout the first 6 weeks compared to this one, Aaron Jones averages 56% of the snaps played, and this one he had 72%. And so it seems as though, and potentially this, once again, is just a one game sample size, though, that in close games or potentially shootout games, Aaron Jones is by far and away going to get the majority of the work. Ty Chandler averages 36% of the snaps played. He went down to 18% in this one. When you look at the average rush shares throughout the first 6 weeks, Aaron Jones averages 48.4, and this one he had 66.67%, so a huge uptick there. While Ty Chandler averages 30.59, and this one he went down to 9.52, so much less involved. On the season, Aaron Jones averages 15.95% of the target share, and this one he had 11.54, a slight downtick there, but nothing too bad. And then Ty Chandler's received 4.77% of the target share, and in this one wasn't involved. And so in terms of what we can conclude, I think that in potentially close games, but especially divisional games, I'd imagine Aaron Jones is going to see an uptick in production. But in games where they probably don't need to work him quite as hard for them to win anyways, that's probably when we're going to see more utilization from Ty Chandler. And so Aaron Jones, far and away, is the running back that you want to plug and play. Ty Chandler remains off the fantasy radar. And so unless an injury, once again, does happen to Aaron Jones, Ty Chandler really has no fantasy value. But in the event Jones does go down, Ty Chandler would be a decent option because he should get a ton of volume. Moving forward to the Bengals backfield, this backfield has changed potentially the most from week 1 up until this point. You could potentially argue Dallas. Chase Brown went from an afterthought to being at least more featured than Zach Moss, especially in the run game. Zach Moss was at first really a featured back for the most part, whereas Chase Brown wasn't getting much utilization. However, Chase Brown has just been so much more efficient that he has really forced them to turn to him. And so in this one against the Browns, really neither one of them was that efficient, but comparatively, Chase Brown went 15 for 44, averaging 2.9 per carry, no touchdown with a long of 22. And so it really wasn't that efficient, but when you look at Zach Moss, he went 6 for 7, averaging 1.2 per carry, no touchdown with a long of 3. And so it was more than twice as efficient as Zach Moss. That continues to be a trend. Through the air, though, Zach Moss is still the better bet. On 3 targets, he had 3 receptions, 33 receiving yards, averaging 11.0 per catch with no touchdown. Chase Brown had 2 targets, 2 receptions, 9 yards, averaging 4.5 per catch with no touchdown as well. And so overall, I don't think Zach Moss is going to have his receiving role taken. He's been quite efficient weekly for the most part through the air. Chase Brown's a little bit more efficient usually than that, but still, I don't think that's going to change in terms of their utilization comparatively. However, when we take a look at the average snap shares throughout the first 6 weeks, Zach Moss has played 65%, and this one he only played 49%. Chase Brown's averaged 36%, and this one he played 51%. So, complete reversal there. When you look at the average rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Zach Moss had 48.06%, and this one he went down to 24%. Chase Brown had 37.08%, and this one he had 60%. And so, just like with the snap share, the rush share is absolutely turning to Chase Brown's favor. Through the air, though, on the season, Zach Moss has a 9.48% average target share, and this one he had 12.5%, so that is an uptick, but he was efficient, so it does make sense. Then Chase Brown on the season has had 8.72, and this one he had 8.33, so really negligible difference there. And so what can we conclude? Well, in this one, neither one was a very good running back, but Chase Brown continues to be much more efficient than Zach Moss. And so he is certainly making his case to have an even bigger role going forward. Zach Moss is absolutely unstartable in basically every format. He needs a touchdown at this point, really, to give you any value, and that would be flex value, in my opinion. And so as long as these trends continue in terms of Chase Brown being much more efficient on the ground than Zach Moss, I think these splits might start to increase even more in his favor, but we will have to keep tabs on that. Taking a look at the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield, this was the Tank Bigsby show. He continues to be utterly impressive on the ground. He had 26 attempts, 118 rushing yards, averaging a solid 4.5 per carry with 2 touchdowns and a long of 13. And so that means in general, he was just getting chunk gains. He didn't really have one long run and this one that massively boosted his yards per carry. And so that is good to see that he was consistently good. D'Ernest Johnson went 9 for 38, averaging 4.2 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 10. Still relatively efficient. Not quite as good, but he's also not as big as Tank Bigsby is. Through the air, though, D'Ernest Johnson was and is going to continue to be, in ETN's absence, the much preferred option in the passing game. On 4 targets, he had 3 receptions, 32 receiving yards, averaging 10.7 per catch and no touchdown. Bigsby continues to basically be a non-factor through the air. 1 target, no receptions, no yardage. And so as long as Travis Etienne is out, I really see Johnson getting most of the receiving work, but Tank Bigsby easily leading the backfield in rush share. When you take a look at the season, though, throughout the first 6 weeks, Bigsby has averaged 24% of the snaps, and this one he played 66%. Etienne has averaged 53%. This one he didn't play, obviously, due to the hamstring injury. D'Ernest Johnson's averaged 24%, and this one he had 34%. And so I do think a big portion of why Bigsby had such a high snap percentage is due to the fact that they were winning this game. In games in which they're losing, I suspect usually Etienne, but in Etienne's absence, D'Ernest Johnson to take over a large portion of the snap share. When you take a look at the average rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Bigsby's had 29.78%, and this one he had 66.67%. Etienne on the seasons had 43.28%, and this one obviously didn't play. D'Ernest Johnson's had 13.04%, and this one he had 23.08%. And through the air, Bigsby's had 0.49% of the target share. He did have 1 target in this one, so he had a 5%. Etienne's averaged 11.45%, didn't play in this one. And D'Ernest Johnson's had 2.79%, but in this one had 20. And so one thing we can conclude is that in games in which Etienne misses and the Jags aren't probably trailing, we probably see a lot more usage from Bigsby. But in games where Etienne's out but the Jags are trailing, we probably stand to see a lot more D'Ernest Johnson due to Bigsby basically being a non-factor in the receiving game. But as far as the efficiency on the ground, Bigsby the entire season has been so much more efficient than Travis Etienne, who, to be fair to him, hasn't really been inefficient usually. It's just, it's so glaring in my opinion that I think Bigsby, especially after this performance, has definitely earned a larger share of the backfield. And so I really think that Etienne is, first of all, a potential trade candidate. And if that were to happen, that would help both of them out tremendously. But I do think that Etienne is going to potentially lose and cede a large portion of his rush share. But through the air, when Etienne's healthy, I don't think he has anything to worry about. I think he's better than even D'Ernest Johnson through the air in general. And so I think Etienne is going to probably move into mid to low end RB3 territory when all 3 are healthy. And then I think with an increased role in games in which they're not trailing substantially, that Bigsby is probably an RB3, but he does have RB1 upside if he goes off. I wouldn't bet on that too often, though. I do think the 25-point game a couple weeks ago was kind of a fluke in terms of he was hyper efficient. But yeah, in general, I think Etienne's an RB3 flex when all are healthy. Bigsby's probably an RB3 flex, but does have a lot more upside. And D'Ernest Johnson's an afterthought. But if Etienne does continue to miss time, or if he gets injured again after coming back, Bigsby has a ton of weekly upside. And in his absence, D'Ernest Johnson's probably just a middling flex play. Looking at the Green Bay Packers backfield, Josh Jacobs was quite efficient in this one. He had 12 carries for 76 rushing yards, averaging 6.3 per carry, no touchdown, but a long of 27. And for the first time in a minute, Emmanuel Wilson was pretty inefficient. On 5 carries, he had 11 rushing yards, averaging 2.2 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 5. And so if you're a Jacobs owner, that's definitely encouraging because over at least the previous 2 games for sure, he was really inefficient on the ground. Then when you look at the air, Wilson was not involved whatsoever, but Josh Jacobs had 5 targets in this one. He had 5 receptions, 16 receiving yards, 3.2 per catch with a touchdown. Interestingly enough, he actually held the NFL record for the most receptions in his career without a receiving touchdown of any player in NFL history. I don't know the specific number, but good for him. He wasn't very efficient, to be honest, through the air, but you will take the target share, the receptions, and especially the receiving touchdown. So that's awesome to see. When we take a look at the average snap shares throughout the first 6 weeks, Josh Jacobs has averaged 65%. He played 67% in this one. Slight uptick, but pretty much negligible. Emmanuel Wilson has averaged 30%. He dipped down to 21% in this one, so definitely a downtick there, but he was also pretty inefficient. Jacobs on the season has averaged 54.75% of the rush share, and this one, that went up to 60%, so a slight uptick in snap share and rush share. Emmanuel Wilson on the season averages 23.58%, and this one, it actually went up to 25%, so despite playing a lesser percentage of the snaps, his share of the rushes did go up. And then when you look through the air, Josh Jacobs averages 6.57% of the target share, and this one it went up to 15.15%. So if you're an owner, you'd love to see that. And then Emmanuel Wilson on the season averages 5.37%. However, he was not targeted in this one. And so what can we conclude? Well, Josh Jacobs, it remains the easy favorite in this backfield. He's a weekly start. You hope for more games like this where he's efficient on the ground and he is able to score a touchdown while also being pretty heavily utilized in the passing game. 5 targets is probably unlikely in most games, I'd imagine, but we do like to see the efficiency. He remains a weekly. It is kind of disappointing, but he does seem more like an RB2 with RB1 upside due to the lack of touchdowns in general. And so as far as Emmanuel Wilson's concerned, he really isn't a startable asset at this point. But if Josh Jacobs were to go down, he would stand to gain a ton of volume. And with him having been pretty efficient throughout the year, we'll have to see on a much increased workload whether he would retain that efficiency. But if he's able to at least retain most of it, there is a ton of upside. And so I do think he's a good stash. Moving on to the Rams backfield, Kyren Williams easily led the backfield once again. His 21 attempts only went for 76 yards though, so that was 3.6 per carry, but he still remains one of the best bets to score a touchdown. He had 2 in this one with a long of 14. Blake Corum, even though he wasn't really that efficient, his 3 attempts went for 11 yards, 3.7 per carry. It is encouraging to see that he is starting to be involved though. His long went for 5. Through the air, though, interestingly enough, neither running back was targeted. That is a rare occurrence. It's generally been Kyren Williams, and it's not that he's received a massive target share, but it is interesting nonetheless to see that neither were. When we take a look at the average snap shares throughout the first 6 weeks, Kyren's played 85%. That went up to 89 in this one. Blake Corum's played 6% in the first 6 weeks. That went up to 11, so interesting that both saw an uptick in snap share. When we take a look at the rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Kyren Williams went from 76.44% on the season down to 75% in this one. A small regression there, but nothing to worry about at all. Blake Corum's had 11.57%, and this one saw 10.71. A slight downtick there, but nothing too crazy either. I wouldn't put too much stock into that. Looking at the target share, though, 9.9 on the season for Williams, none this week. Blake Corum's had 0.44%. In this one, it had none. So an outlier game, in my opinion, in terms of running back production through the air. But as far as on the ground and in terms of total usage, really nothing's changed. Kyren Williams remains an elite RB1, whereas Blake Corum is really just a handcuff. But in the event that Kyren Williams goes down, I'd imagine, and this is speculation, but I'd imagine Blake Corum basically sees the exact same usage. And while he hasn't been incredible on a limited basis, he's definitely been fine. And he would obviously possess a ton of upside. And I think he'd, at the very least, be a high-end RB2, depending on how he looks. But there is a ton of hidden obstructed upside at the moment. And so I would absolutely keep him stashed on your bench. And I really don't expect anything to change unless there is an injury to Kyron Williams. But it is worth monitoring because Blake Corum is starting to see a little bit more usage in this backfield. If you like what you're hearing and seeing, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel. I love keeping track of all of these backfield trends, charting out their average snap, rush, and target shares throughout the first couple of weeks up to the previous week, and then seeing what the averages look like compared to what we saw in the current week. And so if you want to see me continue to do this, just like and subscribe. Thanks. All right, the Giants backfield. This one I may have been completely wrong about. We will have to get a larger sample size, but I had mentioned that I thought due to the fact that Singletary looked pretty good, I mean, he was pretty good before his injury, and the fact that they paid him, that it was unlikely that Tyrone Tracy would just immediately overtake him, despite looking really good in that first week without him. And then at least he looked good through the air in this past week, but he wasn't really efficient on the ground. And it may also be due to the injury to Singletary. He may not be 100%, but it is interesting. Tyrone Tracy led the backfield in carries, going 6 for 23. Wasn't very efficient with 3.8 per carry, along of 8 no touchdown. But Devin Singletary only had 5 in this one. I think GameScript also had something to do with this. But 5 attempts, 18 yards, averaging 3.6 per carry, so less efficient. No touchdown and a long of 10. And then Eric Gray was barely utilized. 1 attempt for 2 yards, no touchdown, long of 2. Through the air, though, Tyrone Tracy remains quite involved, especially considering he wasn't a featured back in this one. He had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 9 yards. Wasn't very efficient on a per target basis in this one, but in general, he's been quite good through the air. Eric Gray had 1 target, 1 reception, 7 yards, and Singletary also had 1 target, 1 reception, and 3. And so through the air, it was quite inefficient for all 3 of them, and on the ground too. But as far as we're concerned here, it is quite interesting to see that Tyrone Tracy, if you look, by far and away led this team in snap share. When we look at the season, Singletary's played 85% throughout the first 6 weeks, and this one he only played 21%. On the season, Tyrone Tracy's played 6% throughout the first 6 weeks, and this one he played 67%, so triple Singletary. And then Eric Gray's played 24% on the season, and this one only played 10%. When we look at the rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Singletary's had 76.44%, and this one had 27.78%. Tyrone Tracy's had 11.57 throughout the first 6 weeks. He had 33.33% in this one. And then Eric Gray's had 13.04%, and this one only had 5.56. When we look at the average target share, Singletary's had 9.9%, and this one only had 3.7, so a downtick there. Tracy's had 0.44%, and this one had 11.11%. And then Eric Gray's had 0.44% throughout the first 6 weeks, and then this one had 3.7. And so what can we conclude? Well, Eric Gray still remains an afterthought when both of the other two were healthy. Tyrone Tracy, though, we'll have to see if it was just mostly due to Devin Singletary recovering from his injury. That is quite interesting, though. He more than tripled Singletary in terms of snap share. He slightly eclipsed him in rush share, and then in target share, he tripled him as well. And so we will need to continue to watch this backfield specifically. Singletary's gone from, a low-end RB2, RB3 kind of running back to, if this trend remains, unstartable in basically any format. And then Tyrone Tracy went from being an afterthought to potentially leading the timeshare of this backfield in just 2 games played. That is awesome work by Tyrone Tracy. And once again, we'll have to see if this trend continues. And so it's looking like Tyrone Tracy is starting to establish himself in this backfield. And so he may become the only running back out of these 3 that we feel comfortable starting weekly. But if all 3 are healthy, I really do think that limits all of them. I'd probably be fine with Tracy in the flex, uh, especially if he keeps the usage that he saw this week throughout the latter half of the season. Singletary, if he sees this utilization, it would be a desperation flex play, and Eric Gray really wouldn't be startable in any format. But yeah, we'll have to see if Tyrone Tracy can continue this usage, or if it was maybe just a 1 week fluke due to Singletary recovering from injury. Moving on to the Dolphins backfield. Devon Achane came back. He looked good. 15 attempts, 77 yards, 5.1 per carry. It's good to see that his efficiency went way up even without Tua. No touchdown, but along of 15. Mostert was pretty efficient as well. He had 11 attempts, 50 yards, 4.5 per carry, no touchdown, and along of 14. But Jalen Wright, 5 attempts, 33 yards, 6.6 per carry, no touchdown, but along of 19. I believe he also had a rather long run called back by penalty. He's looking really, really good. And it is interesting to see that even with Achane and Mostert playing, Jalen Wright is still getting carries. That is a good sign. Through the air, though, Devon Achane firmly remains really the only back getting much of a target share. He had 3 in this one, 2 receptions, 8 yards, 4.0 per catch, no touchdown. Not the most efficient day through the air for him, but I do suspect with Tua potentially returning in week 8, we'll have to keep tabs on that this whole entire offense becomes one of the best in the entire NFL once again. It was against the Colts, so you would expect a relatively efficient game. And it would have been even a lot better, honestly, if Tua had played, but still encouraging nonetheless without him. When we take a look at the average snap share throughout the first 6 weeks, Achane's played 56%, and this one played 58%, so an uptick there. Raheem Mostert's played 20%, and this one played 33%. And Jalen Wright's played 25%, and then this one played 9%. So Achane saw a slight uptick comparatively. So did Mostert. Jalen Wright did see a decrease, but it is still good to see that even if he's the third back, he is getting utilized. When we take a look at the rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Achane's had 41.35%, and this one had 37.5%, so a decrease there. Mostert on the season has had 14.07%, and this one saw 27.5%, so an uptick there. And then Jalen Wright on the season's had 17.13%. This one, it went down to 12.5%. So regression there, but still encouraging to see that he's being utilized even if he's the third back. Looking through the air, though, it remains the Devon Achane show. On the season, he's had 14.4%, and this one had 13.64%. Mostert's had 2.58 on the season, wasn't targeted in this one, and then Jalen Wright on the season has zeros. And so looking at the outlook of this backfield, I think once again, as soon as Tua returns, which is potentially this week, Achane is a must-start high-end RB1 as long as he's healthy. Raheem Mostert probably is a solid flex play, I'd imagine. Jalen Wright, you wouldn't feel comfortable starting it, but if either one of those two goes down, he would probably be a solid flex play. And then next year, I think he's going to be a very solid option in the Mostert role. I suspect Mostert will be gone. And so really the outlook of this backfield is heavily contingent on whether Tua is able to play. There's a chance he plays in week 8. And so as soon as that happens, I think Achane, once again, is an elite RB1. Mostert's a solid flex. And Wright, if one of the other two is injured, is probably a solid flex. All right. Moving to the Raiders backfield. This was the Madison show. On 23 attempts, he had 92 yards. That is 4.0 per carry. Not that great, but you could definitely do worse. No touchdown with a long of 13. Zamir White, though, only had 3 attempts for 13 yards, averaging 4.3 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 9. And then, interestingly enough, despite playing 16% of the snaps in this one, Abdullah didn't register a rush. Then when we look through the air, it was the Madison show. He had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 31 yards, 10.3 per catch, no touchdown, and a long of 18. Zamir White, though, did have 1 target, 1 reception, 14 yards. So quite efficient on his only target. No touchdown for him either. Also interesting, Amir Abdullah once again played 16% of the snaps, but also wasn't targeted. That's a good amount of usage to not have a rush or a target. I don't think that would be the norm if he is able to maintain 16% of the snap share, but interesting. On the season, Zamir White's played 31%, and this one only saw the field for 14%. A definite downtick there. On the season, Madison's had 48%, and this one saw 70%. That is encroaching on featured back territory. At this point, it's just a very solid part of a timeshare, in my opinion. Amir Abdullah on the season's played 20%. On this one, played 16. So a slight downtick there, but nothing crazy. Taking a look at the rushing shares, on the season, Zamir White's had 38.85%, and this one only saw 10.34, so a sharp decrease there. On the season, Madison's had 35.99%. On this one, saw 79.31%. That is what you like to see. And on the season, Amir Abdullah's had 8.8%. Didn't register one in this, so 0. Looking through the air, Zamir White on the season has had 3.58% of the target share, and this one saw 2.86, so a downtick there. Alexander Madison's had 8.74%. In this game saw 8.57, so relatively negligible there. And Amir Abdullah on the season has had 5.42%. This one wasn't targeted. And so what can we conclude here? It looks as though Alexander Madison is firmly taking over this backfield. He's encroaching upon featured territory. Zamir White is being phased out. Amir Abdullah was an afterthought. And so Madison's probably at this point a fine RB3, solid flex, with upside if he happens to score a touchdown. Zamir White is unstartable in any format, and Amir Abdullah is as well. And so this backfield went from Zamir White being a contingent on the game script to getting volume to just not getting any. Alexander Madison was much better in negative game scripts in terms of them trailing. But with his newfound role as potentially trending towards being a featured back, it appears as though he is by far and away the running back to own. And then Amir Abdullah would definitely need an injury to one of the other two. And so, yeah, Madison's by far and away the running back you want to own. And I would not feel comfortable with either of the other two unless there was a Madison injury. Looking at the Bucs backfield, this one last week I was saying was going to be potentially the most interesting of all of them. And it was, the usage was interesting. It was kind of a funny game. They're not going to be playing the Ravens every week. They started off dominating the Ravens and then fell behind and weren't able to catch up. They had two massive injuries to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Godwin's out more than likely for the season. Evans, it's been reported, at least at the point of me recording this video, that probably week 11, potentially week 12. And so why I'm saying that is I do expect in both of their absence for the running backs in this offense to see an uptick in target share. And so we'll have to keep tabs as to whether that ends up happening. But when we take a look at the rushing performances in this game, Rachaad White led the backfield with 10 attempts. He only had 40 yards, though, 4.0 per carry, no touchdown in a long of 8. The Ravens' rush defense in general is pretty good, so that's kind of to be expected. But to be fair, Sean Tucker went 5 for 29, 5.8 per carry, no touchdown, but a long of 15. So he was more efficient. Bucky Irving was really inefficient in this one. Kind of strange because he'd been awesome every game. He did see 9 attempts, though, for 23 yards, 2.6 per carry, but he did score a touchdown on the goal line at the very end. It was garbage time. Still encouraging, though. But when we look through the air, Rachaad White was dominant. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 71 yards, 11.8 per catch with 2 touchdowns and a long of 23. That is awesome. If he could do that every week, he would be an elite RB1. Looking at Bucky Irving, he was great too. 3 targets, 3 receptions, 54 yards, 18 per catch. No touchdown with a long of 25. Sean Tucker was fine. 2 targets, 1 reception, 9 yards. But yeah, Rachaad White was awesome in this game. Bucky Irving was really good through the air. He did get the touchdown. And Sean Tucker is definitely the third running back in this rotation. Very efficient on the ground. Fine through the air, but not the best day overall. And so when we take a look at the average snap share throughout the first 6 weeks, Bucky Irving's played 42%, and this one, it went down to 35%. So a decrease there, but they did turn it into a three-man backfield. Rachaad White's played 57% on the season. That went down to 48% at this one. And then Sean Tucker's played 9% throughout the first 6 weeks, and this one saw 20% of the snaps, so an uptick for him at the expense of both Irving and White. Looking at the average rush share throughout the first 6 weeks, Irving's had 38.55%, and this one saw 30, so a slight downtick there. Rachaad White's seen 34.91% on the season. That went down to 33.33, but that's really a negligible difference. Sean Tucker's seen 8.38%, and this one saw 16.67%, so a high uptick there. Looking through the air, though, in terms of the target share throughout the first 6 weeks, Irving's had 6.25%, and this one saw 6.67, relatively the same. Rachaad White has seen 10.48%, and this one saw 13.33, so an uptick there. And then Sean Tucker's seen 1.74% on the season and saw 4.4 this game, so an uptick there as well. And so what can we conclude? Well, Rachaad White remains an elite receiving back. I definitely think he, out of all of these guys, is the running back to own and plug and play. I think that he's probably a safe RB3 in general, but he does have RB1 upside if he happens to have a very good receiving game. I think Bucky Irving's a fine flex play with RB2 upside in general when White's healthy. Sean Tucker remains unstartable, but if White or Irving misses time, he definitely has plug-and-play ability as a flex option. And so it'll be interesting to see how this three-headed monster works itself out from week to week. I think we do want to see a bigger sample size. It was a weird game against the Ravens, and so we'll have to see how this one continues, but this backfield is quite interesting, and we'll definitely have to see how this shakes out. And so now we look at the Broncos. They played the Saints, and so, of course, they had an awesome game. Everybody's been torching the Saints recently. Javonte Williams went berserk in this one. 14 attempts for 88 yards, 6.3 per carry with 2 touchdowns and a long of 20. Bo Nix, it's not really the point, but he was quite efficient too. Basically, besides Jared Stidham, which I'm pretty sure those were kneels, everybody was hyper efficient in this one. Jaleel McLaughlin went 4 for 35, 8.8 per carry, no touchdown with a long of 21. And then Estime went 5 for 29, 5.8 per carry with no touchdown and a long of 13. He did lose a fumble, though. So there is the opportunity for him to be in the doghouse of Sean Payton. Sean Payton does not play around with fumbles. So we will have to see if his playing time is adversely affected by that fumble next week. Looking through the air, Javonte Williams was the only running back targeted. On 3 targets, he went 3 for 23, 7.7 per catch, no touchdown, and a long of 9. And so overall, an incredibly efficient day on the ground for the Broncos. The only issue was Estime and his fumble. We'll have to see if that, once again, negatively affects his playing time. Looking at the season averages, though, Jaleel McLaughlin averages 31% of the snaps played. He only saw the field for 22% in this one. Javonte Williams averages 59%. He saw the field for 63% of this one, so a slight uptick. And Estime averages 2%, and this one saw 9%. And so it appears as though Audric Estime took over a portion of the snaps at the expense of Jaleel McLaughlin. It could be game script dependent, though. The Broncos were easily winning this game. Looking at the average rush shares throughout the first 6 weeks, McLaughlin had 23.95%, and this one that went down to 11.43. His efficiency has varied tremendously from week to week. Javonte Williams has been a mainstay, though. On the season, he's had 41.66%, and this one saw 40, so a slight downtick there, but nothing crazy. And then Estime's had 3.19%, and this one saw 14.29, so a definite uptick there. Jaleel McLaughlin, throughout the first 6 weeks, in terms of his target shares, had 7.54%. Wasn't targeted in this one. I think GameScript had a lot to do with it. Williams has averaged 15.38%, and this one saw 12, so a slight downtick there, but once again, I think GameScript played a factor here. And then Estimates had 0.35%, and this one wasn't targeted. And so what can we conclude here? Well, Javonte Williams, by far and away, is the running back to own. I think in general, he's a fine RB3. He does have upside, obviously, in positive matchups. McLaughlin, if he gets the usage, is a fine flex play, but he is getting to the point where it's kind of risky to trust him any given week. Estime is really a non-factor here unless there's injury to the other ones, and there's the potential with that fumble that he finds himself in the doghouse of Sean Payton. And yeah, we'll have to see in games in which the Broncos aren't winning heavily. I don't expect that to generally be the case, especially for the duration of most of a game. But Javonte Williams, in general, is going to be the running back that you want to own. McLaughlin, depending on the matchup and utilization, is fine in the flex. And Estime would need an injury, it appears, to the other two, or at least one of them. And so, at least at this point in time, it does seem as though Javonte Williams has a firm hold of this backfield. And with this performance this past week, doesn't look as though he'll be relinquishing that anytime soon. And so that concludes our weekly tracking of ambiguous or outright confounding backfields in terms of snap, rush, and target share in the current week versus the previous weeks combined, and figuring out by the averages what we've seen in those weeks compared to the current week. I think the Buccaneers backfield for a second straight week is going to be the backfield to monitor. It's a three-headed committee now. It seems as though Rachaad White is still the guy to own. Bucky Irving's probably second, and Tucker is third. But we will need to see in a bit more of a normal game script what we can see. I do think that the running backs in general stand to gain a lot in the receiving game with the absence of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. So we'll have to pay attention to target shares specifically. But which of these backfields interests you the most? Is there anything that I missed that you think is of importance? Let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. But yeah, if you want me to continue tracking these backfields in terms of their average snap, rush, and target shares compared to what we see in the current week, just like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.